I've got a riddle for you. What's the greatest rock band of all time?
Well, it's got to be either the Beatles or the Rolling Stones.
You are correct. The Beatles are number 1 and the Stones are number 2. And this isn't just my opinion. That's the result of numerous scientific polls taken over the years by reputable pollsters like Gallup and Monmouth University.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to the core mission of our discussion today.
Yeah.
Because we are looking directly at you, the listener, and asking you to question the very foundation of the biggest, most legendary feud in rock and roll history.
Were the boys from Liverpool and the bad boys from London actually bitter enemies?
Or was this entire clash just a brilliant, fabricated marketing illusion?
It is a massive question because for decades you were expected to pick a side. You were either a Beatles person or a Stones person.
Yeah.
It was treated like a personality test. But let's look closer at those numbers I just mentioned. That Monmouth University poll from 2018 proved that fans never actually needed a bitter feud to pick a favorite.
Right.
When asked to name the greatest rock band of all time, 23% of U.S. adults named the Beatles. The Rolling Stones came in a distant second at 8%.
I mean, just to paint the full picture for you, the runners-up in that poll were Led Zeppelin at 4%.
AC/DC at 4%.
Yep. The Eagles at 3% and Aerosmith at 2%. So the dominance there is staggering.
It's unbelievable.
But the fact that the Stones were so firmly cemented as their ultimate foil, their direct opposite, despite that massive gap in polling, that is no accident.
No, not at all.
That is the blueprint of a perfect publicity stunt.
I want to unpack that because fake rivalries among superstars are basically a publicist's fever dream.
Oh, 100%.
If you can create a binary choice for the public, you own the entire cultural conversation. You force people to invest emotionally. Think about legendary historical and cultural face-offs.
Like in sports.
Exactly. Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier in the boxing ring. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird on the basketball court.
Or look at politics and history. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill.
Yeah.
Or John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Even in classic Hollywood, the media loves a binary.
They eat it up.
Sometimes these rivalries have grains of truth, but the narrative of the feud is what captures your attention.
But how do we categorize this specific feud? Because music rivalries exist on a massive spectrum. On one end, you have the purely manufactured or vastly overstated rivalries.
Like who?
Take the Beach Boys versus the Beatles.
Oh, absolutely.
The narrative was that they were locked in this bitter battle to outdo each other. But history shows there was massive mutual admiration. Brian Wilson and the Beatles were constantly inspiring each other's studio work.
Or look at Elvis Presley versus Pat Boone. That wasn't a personal feud at all. It was just a cultural clash mapped onto two different artists by the press.
You see that everywhere. In the pop diva realm, Mariah Carey versus Whitney Houston was largely a press-driven narrative. Both of them repeatedly denied any real animosity.
But then you move into the middle of the spectrum, the mixed or complicated rivalries. The perfect example here is Oasis versus Blur in the 1990s.
Oh, the Battle of Britpop?
Exactly. The famous same-day single release was entirely orchestrated by the music press and the record labels. But it gets complicated because Liam Gallagher's animosity toward Damon Albarn was incredibly real and personal.
And then you hit the far end of the spectrum, the genuinely real, dangerous rivalries. Biggie and Tupac is the tragic example that was a fatal conflict.
Yeah, very real.
Jay-Z versus Nas involved very real public grievances on both sides. Even Elton John and Rod Stewart had deep-seated personal animosity for years.
So where did the Beatles and the Stones land on this spectrum? To answer that, you have to look at the masterminds behind the curtain.
Brian Epstein and Andrew Lowe Goldham.
They are the architects of this entire myth. They didn't just stumble into this power dynamic, they actively cultivated it.
It was pure business strategy dressed up as a cultural conflict.
The strategy was simple. 2 brands, 1 market, maximum revenue.
Let's talk about the visual branding, because you can't overstate how important that was. Brian Epstein had put the Beatles in matching suits. He had them smile, be polite, and bow in unison at the end of their songs.
Very polished.
They were explicitly branded as safe, approachable, and charming.
Which created a massive vacuum in the market. When Andrew Lowe Oldham took over the Stones, he looked at the Beatles and realized something crucial. You couldn't beat them at their own game.
No, you just look like a copy.
Exactly. If the Stones put on matching suits, they would just be a second-rate Beatles. So he went the exact opposite direction. He told them to stop smiling so much. He encouraged the rougher, unkempt look.
Oldham was actually asked directly if the rivalry was real or manufactured. His response was incredibly revealing. He said he couldn't answer that except to agree with the premise. He noted that the bands had a relationship, and the press simply manufactured it into a competition. He pointed out that nobody complained because it was all par for the course. It was moving records for both of them.
The British music press absolutely devoured the narrative. It was clean versus dirty.
Safe versus dangerous.
The Beatles were Mum's favorites, while the Stones were the band that made Mums nervous.
And the American press amplified it, and by the mid-1960s, this rivalry had taken on a life entirely independent of what the musicians themselves actually thought of each other.
And here's the piece of history that completely shatters the illusion for you. If they were the ultimate anti-Beatles, how do we explain 1963?
Because John Lennon and Paul McCartney actually gave the Rolling Stones a song called I Want to Be Your Man.
They literally handed it over. And not just as a throwaway. They finished writing it in the corner of a club while the Stones were in the room.
Think about the magnitude of that. They essentially gifted their supposed bitter rivals a top 10 single that helped break them into the mainstream.
You do not hand your enemy ammunition.
Never.
If you truly hate a rival band, you don't give them a hit song that ensures they stay on the charts right alongside you.
Absolutely not. And what's fascinating is how the Stones arranged it. The Beatles eventually recorded their own version, which is very bouncy and pop-oriented.
Classic early Beatles.
But the Stones took that gift and injected it with this gritty slide guitar energy. They made it rougher. Even when collaborating, they were playing their assigned roles in this grand musical theater.
But the camaraderie didn't stop with just one song. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were regularly hanging out and attending Beatles recording sessions.
They were physically in the room.
Imagine sitting in the studio, maybe watching Paul lay down a brilliant line on the bass guitar, just observing and learning from your supposed enemies.
You don't invite your bitter rivals into your sacred creative space to watch your process.
You just don't.
Lennon was also constantly praising the Stones in public interviews during those early years. He would openly talk about how great their records were.
But the press largely ignored all of those positive quotes because it completely ruined their carefully constructed narrative.
A headline that says, John Lennon thinks the Stones are great, simply doesn't sell as many magazines as Beatles and Stones go to war.
There is a fantastic quote from Keith Richards that perfectly summarizes their kinship. He pointed out that either John Lennon or George Harrison could have easily fit into the Rolling Stones lineup. He said, "We were the same generation, and we all loved the same music."
That shared DNA is crucial for you to understand. What both bands shared, and what the rivalry framing always obscured, was an absolute obsessive commitment to 1950s American roots music.
As teenagers in post-war England, they were hearing these records coming across the Atlantic, and it fundamentally rewired their brains.
They worshipped the exact same heroes: Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Muddy Waters, Buddy Holly.
The Beatles and the Stones weren't actually fighting for the same musical territory. They were two groups of kids who had fallen in love with the exact same records, but they ended up finding entirely different ways to express that love.
Exactly. They took that shared foundation and walked down completely diverging paths. The Beatles turned inward.
Into the studio.
Right. They focused heavily on studio experimentation, bringing in classical instruments, experimenting with complex tape loops, and pushing massive conceptual ambition. They wanted to see how far the boundaries of pop music could be stretched, turning the recording studio itself into an instrument.
Meanwhile, the Rolling Stones eventually went back to the roots. While they certainly had their brief psychedelic detours, they ultimately stripped all of that away.
They leaned into a raw, durable, blues-heavy sound that felt dangerous and grounded.
They wanted to perfect the groove, the swagger, and the grit of the blues that inspired them in the first place.
Okay, I hear what you're saying about the mutual respect and the shared roots, but you can't have egos that massive operating at the absolute pinnacle of global fame without some genuine friction.
Sure.
Even among fast friends, there had to be a competitive edge.
Oh, without a doubt. And Keith Richards has always been incredibly candid about the creative hierarchy between the two bands.
What did he say?
Well, in his memoir, Life, he openly admitted that the Beatles were creatively ahead of the Stones. He acknowledged that the Beatles were the ones paving the new roads, and the Stones were often observing where those roads went before deciding their next move.
Mick Jagger, on the other hand, was always a bit more guarded and defensive about the comparison. You can see it clearly when you look at the dynamic between the Stones album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request, and the Beatles' landmark album, Sgt. Pepper.
It's impossible to ignore the influence there. Sgt. Pepper shifted the entire paradigm of what a rock album could be.
It wasn't just a collection of singles, it was a unified artistic statement.
And the Stones immediately felt the pressure to respond, which led to Satanic Majesties. It was their attempt to match that psychedelic conceptual weight.
And Jagger had a famous description he loved to make to protect the Stones' identity whenever those comparisons came up.
He was very protective of their image.
He stated, "The Beatles were a pop band. We were a blues band. We played blues and we played in clubs. We didn't play adolescent love songs at all."
It was his way of drawing a line in the sand.
He was essentially claiming that the Beatles might have the pop supremacy, but the Stones had the authentic, gritty blues soul.
But if we look at John Lennon, his private stance was much more complex than his public generosity. While he was nice to them in the press early on, privately, Lennon very much saw the Rolling Stones as followers rather than true innovators.
Interesting.
He believed the Beatles were always the ones taking the creative risks, and that the Stones were essentially just a fantastic R&B band doing what they did brilliantly, but not necessarily breaking new artistic ground.
Lennon had a famously sharp tongue, and it fully came out in a fiery 1970 interview. By that point, the media narrative of the safe Beatles versus the dangerous Stones had clearly gotten under his skin.
He deeply resented the idea that the Stones were perceived as these gritty revolutionaries while the Beatles were seen as the establishment.
His quote is absolutely brutal. He said they were not in the same class, music-wise or power-wise, never were.
That is a staggering quote.
Yeah.
It shows you the psychological toll of that manufactured rivalry.
Yeah.
Even if you know it's a marketing trick, constantly hearing yourself compared to someone else for a decade is going to breed resentment.
And let's not leave Paul McCartney out of this. Paul usually bends over backwards to avoid bad-mouthing anyone in show business. He is the ultimate diplomat.
Usually, yes.
But even he enjoys subtly pointing out that the Beatles had an artsy edge that elevated them above any other band, including the Stones. He likes to remind people of the avant-garde influences, the sheer musical complexity they were pulling off.
So you have this fascinating mix. Mutual respect, genuine affection, shared origins, but definitely an occasional sharp competitive edge.
But when you look at the entirety of their relationship, there's absolutely nothing remotely resembling genuine hatred.
No, nothing at all.
Which brings us to a fascinating point of comparison, the final chapters of these two legendary bands, or, more accurately, the incredible contrast in their endings.
The trajectory of how they finished is almost too poetic to be believable.
It's completely fascinating. Consider the Beatles. The band that was explicitly marketed as the safe, reliable, clean-cut favorites completely imploded.
They officially broke up in 1970, entirely surrounded by a dark cloud of legal disputes, intense personal bitterness, and complete creative exhaustion.
They burned incredibly bright for a single revolutionary decade and then shattered into pieces.
And then you have the Rolling Stones, the ultimate irony. The band that was explicitly manufactured by Andrew Loog Oldham to be the unstable, chaotic, dangerous alternative.
Turned out to be the most durable institution in the history of rock and roll.
Never broke up.
Never. The rivalry that was invented out of thin air to sell records ended with the most poetic divergence imaginable. One band became an immortal legend through their sudden dissolution, locking their legacy in a perfect, untouchable decade.
You can never go see the Beatles play a reunion tour, which keeps them frozen in time.
And the other band became an immortal legend through their sheer, stubborn refusal to quit, touring the globe and filling stadiums for over half a century.
Brian Epstein and Andrew Loog Oldham were brilliant marketers, but they could not have scripted a better finale if they had spent a lifetime trying.
Although neither of those managers lived to see how completely this story outgrew anything they could have possibly planned.
It is the ultimate testament to the music itself. The marketing, the matching suits, the clean versus dirty headlines that all got you to look.
But the undeniable generational talent of both bands is what kept you listening for decades.
Spot on.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. We've established that the rivalry was a manufactured marketing trick, a media-driven myth designed to sell records and magazines.
Right.
But when you are constantly being compared to a rival by the entire global press, day in and day out, for years, does that illusion eventually become a reality in your own mind?
Did the sheer relentless pressure of playing along with that media-driven myth actually force both the Beatles and the Stones to push their creative boundaries far further than they ever would have on their own?
If the world tells you you are in a race, maybe you start running faster, even if you never wanted to compete in the first place.
I love that thought.
Well, thanks for joining us today. Whenever you feel like knowing more about the Beatles, visit us at BeatlesRewind.com. It's the Beatles all day, every day, 8 days a week. Cass, we'll do it again tomorrow.
Right. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Goodbye, everyone.
Until next time, when you listen.
Your mind conducts its own symphony.